Immunity challenge. The race towards COVID-19 immunity is changing the way vaccines are developed and brought to market. Here, experts explain how money talks when it comes to the vaccine industry. By Susan Muldowney. Key takeaways from this audio article. In the past, the vaccines market has made up a small portion of the trillion-dollar global pharmaceutical market due to lower profit margins. The high costs and complexity of large-scale vaccine manufacturing are the reasons for the market dominance by four major players, who account for about 85% of the market. The race to develop an effective COVID-19 vaccine has driven increased research collaboration and is set to change the industry significantly in the future. The article begins. The 49.6 billion Australian dollar vaccine industry received a shot in the arm last year when the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a global race to combat the deadly virus. Biotechnology behemoth CSL became a leading contender with a deal to produce 30 million doses of the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca's vaccine. CSL's earnings spiked to 3 billion Australian dollars in 2020, a rise of 17% on the previous year, and a testament to just how lucrative the vaccine industry has become. It wasn't always this way. The vaccine market makes up a small percentage of the trillion-dollar worldwide pharmaceutical industry. Profit margins for vaccines, generally administered once a year or once in a lifetime, are far lower than those of daily drug treatments. Pharmaceutical company Wyeth, now owned by Pfizer, stopped making influenza vaccines almost 20 years ago because the margins were so low. However, the industry has grown sixfold over the past 2 decades, largely due to increasing global demand for vaccines, especially in developing nations. Since the year 2000, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has provided vaccinations for 760 million children in some of the world's poorest countries. The introduction of blockbuster vaccines such as Gardasil, the human papillomavirus vaccine, launched by US drug maker Merck in 2006, has also contributed to the growth. Worldwide sales of Gardasil topped 4.5 billion Australian dollars in 2018, outpacing the previous year's sales of 3.3 billion, and signalling further growth for a market predicted to be worth 88.2 billion Australian dollars by 2027. The science and economics behind the vaccine industry have evolved significantly since the world's first vaccination station for smallpox opened in the UK in the year 1800. The cost and complexity of manufacturing vaccines at scale help explain the dominance of four pharmaceutical giants, GlaxoSmithKline, Sanofi, Merck, and Pfizer, which account for around 85% of the market. Shane Story, Senior Research Analyst, Healthcare and Biotechnology at Wilson's Advisory, says, "There's about 170 million doses of the flu vaccine made globally each year, and the majority of them are still made in chicken eggs. Interestingly, we'll see that transition over to cell-based manufacturing. But if you're making a live attenuated vaccine, you are growing large amounts of infectious virus particles, and you need the facilities to do that safely and efficiently with the right quality controls. It costs a lot. You and I are not about to start a vaccine company tomorrow." Story adds. Professor Brendan Crabb, Director and CEO of Melbourne's Macfarlane Burnet Institute for Medical Research and Public Health, notes that prior to COVID-19, vaccine manufacturers would spend between 1.4 billion and 2.8 billion Australian dollars before they could even sell a single dose. He says, "Who's got that kind of money, together with the risk that the vaccine is not even going to work? The payoff is huge when it happens, and that's why they're called blockbusters. But there is so much risk associated with whether it will work or not. Vaccines must undergo 3 phases of clinical trials in humans before they can be licensed for commercial distribution, and this can take years, largely due to the cost of each step. The final stage of vaccine production is the most significant, notes Professor Hilary Thomas, KPMG's Chief Medical Advisor in the UK and a member of the Global Centre of Excellence in Healthcare and Life Sciences. The main costs, as with any new clinical development, tend to be when you start trialling it with larger numbers of people. That's because it takes time, and you've got to track quite a lot of detail about what's happening to them. In the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, we're seeing tens of thousands of patients going into clinical trials. The cost of laboratories and benches is completely dwarfed by the cost of phase 3 trials, she adds. In a crisis like COVID-19, however, much of the cost is covered by the taxpayers. The US federal government, for instance, poured more than $9 billion into the development and manufacturing of candidate vaccines last year. Meanwhile, researchers in the UK benefited from £84 million worth of new government funding. In Australia, almost $6 million Australian dollars in additional funding from the Medical Research Futures Fund Coronavirus Research Response was allocated to support research and development of the country's COVID-19 vaccines. Professor Brendan Crabb explains that throwing money at a problem can radically speed up the process. The main reason vaccines take so long is the agonizing risk-benefit equation for investors. Every step of the way, an escalating financial risk is cautiously taken and analysed within an inch of its life. Money makes a massive difference to speed, he says. Vaccine profit margins differ depending on the sector. Pediatric vaccines, for instance, benefit from a reoccurring patient population. Babies are born each year and need to be vaccinated, so you've got a nice repeat business, says Shane Story. As time goes on, you can work out how to bring your costs under control and extract some nice margins. However, profits for vaccinations like influenza can be harder to predict, explains Story. Even though you have the same population turning up each year, you have a different influenza virus popping up each year too. So the composition of the vaccine changes year on year. Every year, there's also a substantial amount of vaccine that is unused and returned. That typically comes off the gross margin. In contrast to the influenza vaccine, every single dose of COVID-19 vaccine will be highly prized across the globe. Dr. Jane Williams, researcher and medical ethicist with the Sydney Health Ethics team at the University of Sydney's Charles Perkins Centre, says this presents significant ethical questions. With a pandemic vaccine, there's always going to be scarcity, at least initially, and that's where ethics comes into it. It's just impossible to make enough in one go. The Australian government's position is that everyone who needs the vaccine will get the vaccine eventually, and that's the best anyone can do. But if we're in a disastrous situation, who gets it first? Williams explains that her current work focuses on planning for infectious diseases emergencies. When I was looking at the pandemic plans for what was assumed would be a pandemic influenza, even small countries that aren't poor, like New Zealand for example, really struggle to ensure they get adequate vaccines quickly. Because essentially it's all about making deals with the pharmaceutical companies to try and negotiate a price. If you're a country with a small population, you don't have much bargaining power because you're not buying a massive volume of the vaccine. Thomas notes that the pandemic has seen many big pharma companies commit to prioritizing wide-scale distribution over purchasing power. She says, the interesting thing with COVID-19 is that some of the drug manufacturers have said that at a time like this, they can't be seen to be profiteering. Whatever margins they're making, they won't be comparable to the margins they would be making in other settings. Not everyone has said that, and it will be interesting to see how it plays out. The COVID-19 pandemic looks set to transform the vaccine industry, and Thomas expects greater collaboration among key players. We're seeing that already, she says. An example is GlaxoSmithKline and Sanofi. They're the only two major producers of the flu vaccine, so they'd normally be competitors. They're actually working together on the COVID-19 vaccine. I think this crisis has shone a different light on the industry, which is often seen by people as being of high margin and slightly greedy. Elizabeth de Sumner, CEO of Medicines Australia, says the pandemic has presented tremendous learnings and opportunities. I think that with some of the mechanisms to make these processes more efficient, it may be difficult to maintain momentum because it costs more to do things in parallel and do things quickly, she says. There is an incentive when you've got lots of sick people, whereas if you're testing vaccines for some diseases that may not be as rampant as this one, it might be harder to speed these things up. However, I think there are some opportunities for efficiencies and speed, and for continued collaboration across science, industry, governments, and philanthropic organisations. This sharing of information and data is for the public benefit, and that's been a great learning. Professor Brendan Crabb says COVID-19 has renewed attention on the economic value of health and medical research. I grew up working on influenza in my scientific career, and it was so obvious that what we needed was an influenza vaccine that you took just once and it protected you against all strains. That's technically a complicated thing to do, which is part of why there isn't one, but mostly it's because there's a lack of will to do it. If you had a COVID like mentality that said, by next year we're going to have one of those vaccines, it would happen. Crabb believes the pandemic has renewed the impetus to make better vaccines, as well as new ones for the pandemics of the past, such as malaria and HIV. To the barriers that were once considered insurmountable, such as to make a universal influenza vaccine, COVID mentality now says nothing is insurmountable. Let's take it on. We don't need to rely on importing a technology or waiting until someone else does it. Let's just do it.